See, the Democrats are trying to find their footing, and it's quite embarrassing, actually. I mean, Gavin Newsom. I mean, have you seen what he's doing online? And say, just take a deep breath. Yeah. Don't try to turn the ship 180 degrees and one. They don't know what to do.
Tulsi Gabbard's confrontation with California Governor Gavin Newsom became one of those rare political moments where sparks flew. The audience hung on every word, and the stage itself seemed to shake with the weight of clashing philosophies.
Mr. President, I will be the first to brief you once we have that information collected. But you're right, we are finding documents literally tucked away in the back of safes and random offices in these bags and in other areas, which again speaks to the intent of those who are trying to hide the truth from the American people.
She came prepared not only with rhetoric, but with a relentless determination to scrutinize every aspect of his record in California. And in doing so, she carved through his defenses with a directness that stunned both supporters and critics. From the moment she began addressing Newsom, it was clear she was not interested in polite exchanges or carefully padded statements. Her mission was to expose his leadership, and she did so with precision and intensity. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The opening salvo cut straight to California's most visible problems, issues that have been in the national spotlight for years. Gabbard drew attention to homelessness, citing the state's streets filled with encampments that have multiplied even as billions were allocated to address the crisis. She pressed hard on the contradiction between Newsom's promises of compassionate governance and the stark reality visible in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. Her words were not abstract. They painted the image of a once prosperous state struggling under policies that, in her framing, had failed to deliver tangible relief to its citizens. Newsom attempted to deflect, but Gabbard's insistence on concrete results left him with little room to maneuver. As the exchange deepened, she pivoted to California's economic climate. Here, her critique became sharper. Gabbard described the state as a place where small businesses suffocate under taxes, regulations, and rising costs of living, forcing many to either close shop or flee to friendlier states. Her framing suggested that Newsom's leadership had made California a model not of progress, but of how rapid overreach and poor fiscal stewardship can erode opportunity. This line of attack resonated because it connected economic policy to personal impact. Families leaving California not out of preference, but out of necessity. When the subject turned to energy and environment, Gabbard displayed both nuance and aggression. She acknowledged California's ambitious climate goals, but she accused Newsom of allowing those ambitions to morph into hypocrisy. She pointed out rolling blackouts, surging gas prices, and the reliance on imported energy, even as California touted itself as a beacon of sustainability. Her argument wasn't against environmental responsibility. It was against the mismatch between lofty rhetoric and dysfunctional execution. This was a particularly piercing attack because it struck at the heart of Newsom's brand as a progressive leader. Her tone shifted slightly as she highlighted the struggles of working-class Californians, tying their plight to the failures of state leadership. She spoke of parents struggling to keep their children in safe schools, of neighborhoods grappling with rising crime rates, and of middle-class families suffocating under housing costs. The way she wove these points together created a narrative of a state in decline, a place where leadership had become more interested in posturing on the national stage than solving problems at home. Newsom attempted to frame California as a land of innovation and progress, but Gabbard was relentless in pointing to what everyday citizens experience. One of the most striking parts of her dismantling came when she addressed public safety. Gabbard did not shy away from painting a vivid picture of residents living with fear, citing lenient policies and decisions that, in her words, prioritized criminals over victims. She tied this back to a broader critique of misplaced priorities, suggesting that leadership had focused on ideological points rather than the practical responsibility of keeping communities safe. The directness of her words seemed to catch Newsom off guard, as it left little room for the kind of broad generalizations he often relies on. From there, she widened her scope to education. Gabbard accused Newsom of presiding over a system that has become less about empowering students and more about entangling them in bureaucracy and politicized agendas. She spoke of parents frustrated with their lack of say in their children's schooling, of teachers overwhelmed by mandates and under-resourced classrooms, and of students caught in the middle. Her critique of the educational system was not just about statistics. It was about the trust between families and government, and how that trust had been frayed. Throughout the exchange, what made Gabbard's words cut so deeply was her ability to connect each critique to a broader theme: the failure of leadership. She did not simply list problems, she wove them into a story of neglect, arrogance, and detachment from the lived experiences of Californians. This gave her argument a rhythm and coherence that made it difficult for Newsom to deflect each time he attempted to counter with a statistic or claim of progress. She circled back to the visible realities on the ground, realities that statistics alone could not wash away. Her attacks also carried weight because of her own political positioning. Gabbard, no longer confined by partisan loyalty, spoke with a kind of independence that resonated with those frustrated by entrenched party politics. Her criticism of Newsom came not as a rival governor or partisan opponent, but as someone willing to shine a light on failures without regard for political fallout. This lent her words an authenticity that deepened their impact. The audience reaction underscored the effectiveness of her assault. As she pressed Newsom on issue after issue, the murmurs grew louder, the gasps more frequent. Some nodded in agreement, others seemed stunned at her unflinching delivery. The dynamic was electric, a reminder that moments like this can reshape perceptions not just of the individuals on stage, but of the issues themselves. What truly defined the exchange, however, was the way it crystallized broader national debates. Gabbard's criticisms of California under Newsom became a symbol of the clash between lofty progressive ambitions and the practical realities of governance. For viewers outside California, her words transformed the state into a case study of what happens when leadership loses touch with the balance between ideals and execution. This gave the confrontation a resonance beyond the personalities involved, elevating it into a conversation about the future of American governance. Her dismantling of Newsom's record also carried implications for the trajectory of political discourse. By refusing to soften her language or dilute her arguments, she demonstrated that direct confrontation can pierce through the fog of carefully scripted talking points. For many watching, this was a refreshing departure from the usual cautiousness of political debates. It reminded people that accountability requires more than politeness. It requires the courage to call out failures with clarity and persistence. The emotional intensity of her words also revealed a different dimension of political leadership. Gabbard tapped into the frustrations of citizens who feel ignored or dismissed by those in power. She gave voice to their concerns, channeling them into a pointed critique of Newsom's tenure. In doing so, she showcased the power of empathy in political combat. Not empathy for the opponent, but empathy for the people affected by policy decisions. This allowed her to wield criticism not as abstract ideology, but as the lived experience of millions. Her confrontation with Newsom also highlighted the limits of charisma in the face of relentless scrutiny. Newsom, long praised for his polished presentation and ease in public settings, found himself cornered by the sheer bluntness of Gabbard's approach. The shine of his rhetoric seemed to dull when juxtaposed against her relentless focus on real-world consequences. This created a striking contrast. The image-driven politician versus the soldier-turned-stateswoman, determined to strip away the facade. The implications of this clash were immediate for California's image on the national stage. Gabbard's dissection of its problems under Newsom challenged the state's narrative as a shining example of progress. Instead, she presented it as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when ambition outpaces accountability. For Californians watching, it forced a moment of reflection on whether their leadership had delivered the promises it so often proclaimed. For observers beyond the state, it carried even greater weight. California has long been held up as a model for progressive governance, a place where the future is imagined and built. By dismantling that image in real time, Gabbard challenged not only Newsom, but the broader notion that California's path should be the nation's path. This injected a dose of skepticism into conversations about policy direction at the federal level. The confrontation also carried lessons for political strategy. Gabbard's effectiveness stemmed not from showmanship, but from substance. She armed herself with specifics, wove them into a cohesive narrative, and delivered them with unwavering confidence. Her performance suggested that in an age of carefully curated sound bites, there remains room for leaders who speak plainly, directly, and with conviction. This dynamic reshaped the atmosphere of the event. What began as a standard exchange evolved into something far more consequential. A dismantling of a record, a clash of visions, and a reminder that leadership must be measured not by image, but by results. Gabbard's words lingered because they were rooted in realities that could not be denied, realities that every viewer could recognize. By the time the exchange concluded, it was clear that something significant had transpired. Gabbard had not simply sparred with Newsom, she had exposed him. Her relentless focus on failures, her refusal to be distracted by deflections, and her connection to the frustrations of ordinary citizens made her critique unforgettable. It was the kind of moment that lives on in political memory, not because of theatrics, but because of its raw, undeniable force. And so, her confrontation with Gavin Newsom stands as more than just a heated exchange between two politicians. It was a test of leadership under fire, a measure of accountability delivered in real time, and a challenge to the narratives that shape political identities. In every sense, Tulsi Gabbard destroyed the image Newsom tried to project, leaving behind a portrait of a leader whose record could not withstand the light of scrutiny. Under the harsh glare of the lights, the atmosphere of the room was already tense, but what came next elevated the moment beyond a mere debate or routine exchange of political critiques. Tulsi Gabbard, already known for her directness, leaned into a style that fused calm precision with unrelenting force. She had already stripped away much of Gavin Newsom's polish by highlighting the broad failures of his administration, but she wasn't finished. What followed was an expansion of her dismantling, branching into areas often overlooked in political discourse yet deeply tied to the lived experiences of Californians and, by extension, the credibility of leadership itself. She moved into healthcare, a subject often layered with complexity but critical to millions. Gabbard emphasized that California, despite its wealth and progressive ambitions, had failed to deliver accessible and affordable healthcare solutions to its population. She highlighted the bottlenecks in Medi-Cal, where patients faced long wait times and many doctors opted out due to reimbursement struggles. In her framing, the state's healthcare apparatus was emblematic of leadership that favored flashy announcements of universal access while failing to solve the ground-level dysfunctions. The argument landed sharply because she connected it to people struggling to afford prescriptions, seniors navigating convoluted systems, and families driven into debt by medical expenses. For Gabbard, this wasn't an abstract policy critique, but an indictment of a leader more focused on appearances than fixing broken systems. From there, she tied healthcare to mental health, another deeply pressing issue in California. She described how untreated mental illness fed into broader crises: homelessness, crime, substance abuse. Yet the state's investments seemed to evaporate without producing noticeable improvements. She pressed the idea that leadership required not just pouring money into programs, but ensuring accountability, measurable progress, and dignity for the individuals affected. Newsom attempted to pivot by touting initiatives, but Gabbard dismantled that defense by highlighting the visible absence of results in communities across the state. The implication was clear: words and dollars mean little without transformation on the ground. Having already targeted the foundations of domestic policy, she pivoted toward California's infrastructure, and here her critique carried a historic weight. California was once celebrated for its engineering marvels, the freeways, aqueducts, and systems that fueled its growth. Gabbard contrasted that legacy with the present reality: decaying roads, delayed projects, and the infamous high-speed rail, which she described as a monument to mismanagement. Billions spent, years wasted, and little progress to show. This was, in her framing, the very embodiment of leadership failure. She suggested that Californians deserved modern infrastructure that matched the state's economic power, not vanity projects that consumed resources without delivering functionality. By tying the decline of infrastructure to leadership, she broadened the indictment. It wasn't simply about potholes or trains, but about trust squandered and opportunities lost. Her assault did not spare California's handling of natural disasters, particularly wildfires. Gabbard drew on her own experience as a former member of the armed forces to underscore the importance of preparation, resilience, and decisive leadership in times of crisis. She pointed to the repeated devastation wrought by wildfires, the power shutoffs that left communities vulnerable, and the perception that state leadership was perpetually reacting rather than preparing. Her argument was not that wildfires could be eliminated, but that Californians deserved leaders who would prioritize forest management, invest in preventative measures, and communicate transparently during emergencies. By focusing on this, she spoke to the fears of families forced to evacuate their homes, businesses destroyed, and lives upended, all while holding Newsom directly responsible for a lack of foresight. The critique deepened further as she tackled California's water crisis. Gabbard made the case that leadership in such a resource-rich state should never allow residents to fear scarcity. Yet years of drought, mismanagement of reservoirs, and political infighting had left the state vulnerable. She argued that instead of investing in long-term solutions, desalination plants, modernized infrastructure, and effective water distribution, Newsom's administration leaned on temporary fixes. For farmers in the Central Valley, this translated into devastating crop losses, while households in urban centers faced restrictions and rising costs. Gabbard's framing painted this as another failure of leadership's priorities, where immediate appearances were valued over sustainable planning. In expanding her assault, she also confronted California's growing inequality. While Newsom often touted California's status as the fifth largest economy in the world, Gabbard flipped that narrative by emphasizing the stark divide between wealth and poverty. She described Silicon Valley billionaires thriving while middle-class families fled, and low-income communities struggled without opportunity. The state's prosperity, she argued, was concentrated in elite pockets, while the rest of the population carried the burden of high taxes, rising rents, and eroding services. This line of attack resonated because it stripped away the glamour of California's international reputation and exposed the hollow reality for everyday residents. Her criticism extended into the realm of governance itself, questioning the very structures that enabled dysfunction. Gabbard dissected the entanglement of California's leadership with special interests, lobbyists, and corporate donors. She suggested that decisions were being made not in the interest of Californians, but in service to those who funded campaigns and influenced policy. By drawing this connection, she not only targeted Newsom, but also challenged the broader culture of governance in Sacramento. The implication was stark. Leadership had become compromised, and the people were paying the price. One of the most powerful pivots came when she discussed the loss of trust between citizens and their government. Gabbard described a climate where residents no longer believed in the promises of their leaders, where cynicism had replaced hope. She argued that leadership must be measured by the trust it maintains with its people, and by that measure, Newsom had failed. Whether on healthcare, housing, education, or safety, Californians had heard endless promises yet lived a reality that betrayed those assurances. By invoking trust as the ultimate currency of governance, she framed her critique in moral as well as practical terms. Her focus then shifted toward California's role on the national stage. Newsom, she argued, had spent more time cultivating a national image than solving the crises in his own state. Gabbard described this as a betrayal of duty. A governor elected to serve Californians, yet seemingly more concerned with building a platform for higher office. She framed his ambitions as evidence of misplaced priorities, suggesting that true leadership meant committing fully to the responsibilities at hand rather than chasing prestige. This line of attack cut deeply because it reframed his charisma and ambition as liabilities rather than assets. As the confrontation continued, Gabbard's delivery became a study in contrasts. She was calm but firm, unflinching but not theatrical. This demeanor amplified the weight of her words. Unlike politicians who raise their voices to command attention, Gabbard wielded the quiet authority of conviction, forcing listeners to lean in rather than recoil. This style magnified the impact of her points, each critique delivered like a scalpel rather than a hammer, cutting through the defenses with precision. The implications of this dismantling extended far beyond the individuals on stage. For Californians, it was a mirror held up to their lived experience, forcing them to confront whether their leadership had truly delivered. For the broader nation, it raised questions about whether California's model was sustainable or desirable. Gabbard's performance became a catalyst for rethinking assumptions about governance, progress, and the balance between ambition and accountability. What made this confrontation so gripping was not just the substance, but the symbolism. Gabbard, positioned as a political outsider with little to lose, stood against a polished insider with everything to protect. It was David versus Goliath in rhetorical form, and the drama of that imbalance gave the exchange an almost cinematic quality. But unlike fiction, the stakes were real, measured in the lives, livelihoods, and futures of millions of Californians. The moment also highlighted a shift in political culture. Audiences increasingly demand authenticity, plain speech, and accountability, and Gabbard delivered all three in abundance. Her refusal to temper her words for the sake of politeness or party loyalty resonated in a landscape weary of spin. She demonstrated that dismantling an opponent does not require cruelty or theatrics, only a willingness to confront failures head-on with clarity and conviction. By the time the dust settled, the exchange had evolved into something larger than a political skirmish. It was a meditation on the nature of leadership itself, a reminder that charisma cannot substitute for competence, and that ambition without accountability erodes trust. Gabbard's dissection of Newsom's record crystallized these truths in a way that was both devastating and unforgettable. And so, the destruction she wrought on Gavin Newsom's image was not only about the failures of one governor, but about the broader cautionary tale of leadership untethered from responsibility. It was a vivid demonstration that when rhetoric collides with reality, only the truth survives. And in that collision, Tulsi Gabbard emerged as the voice of that truth, stripping away illusions and leaving her opponent exposed in the harshest possible light. The intensity of Tulsi Gabbard's challenge to Gavin Newsom did not ease once the core areas of policy had been dissected. Instead, she expanded the battlefield into new territory, venturing into areas where the cracks in California's governance were less publicly discussed, but equally significant in shaping the everyday lives of its residents. This expansion of her critique demonstrated not only her command of detail, but her ability to connect disparate issues into a unified portrait of systemic dysfunction under Newsom's leadership. She began by addressing technology governance, a subject deeply entwined with California's identity. Silicon Valley has long been a symbol of innovation, prosperity, and global influence, yet Gabbard argued that state leadership had failed to harness this wealth of resources to uplift the broader population. She pointed to the irony of a state leading in digital revolutions while failing to ensure basic digital equity for its residents. Rural communities still struggled with unreliable broadband access, and poorer urban areas lagged behind in connectivity, cutting residents off from opportunities in education and remote work. Her argument was that leadership should have recognized the centrality of technology to modern life and ensured access as a universal right, rather than leaving gaps that perpetuated inequality. This naturally flowed into her critique of California's digital privacy and security policies. Gabbard noted that while the state touted itself as a pioneer in regulating tech companies, the reality for ordinary Californians was a constant erosion of privacy and limited transparency about how data was being used. She argued that Newsom's administration had allowed powerful corporations to maintain an outsized influence while ordinary citizens bore the risks of surveillance, data breaches, and exploitation. By raising this, she not only dismantled California's reputation as a global leader in technology, but also reframed the conversation around the protection of citizens in an increasingly digital age. Her dismantling then expanded into cultural and social dynamics. California has long presented itself as the epicenter of progressivism, but Gabbard argued that this self-image had devolved into a form of elitism that ignored or outright dismissed the concerns of working families. She painted a picture of a political class more interested in curating a narrative of moral superiority than engaging with the lived struggles of its residents. By framing this as arrogance in governance, she transformed the conversation from one of policy failures to one of cultural disconnect, suggesting that under Newsom, leadership had become detached, insulated, and self-referential. Moving further into cultural critique, Gabbard explored California's declining sense of community cohesion. She spoke of rising isolation, the breakdown of civic trust, and the alienation many residents felt from their own government. These weren't issues easily measured by statistics, but they resonated because they tapped into the unease of residents watching their neighborhoods transform without their consent. Their traditions being brushed aside and their voices drowned out by distant elites. Gabbard tied this to leadership that had prioritized ideology over inclusion, further deepening the chasm between leaders and citizens. She also pressed into the issue of public transit, which in California had long been mired in inefficiency and underperformance. Gabbard contrasted the promises of environmentally friendly modern systems with the reality of delays, unreliable service, and prohibitive costs. She argued that for a state claiming to lead the way on climate action, failing to provide accessible and effective public transportation was nothing short of hypocrisy. By focusing here, she broadened her dismantling to include not only the failures of high-profile projects like the high-speed rail, but also the everyday frustrations of commuters trying to navigate inadequate systems. The critique expanded to agriculture and the treatment of farmers. California, as the nation's breadbasket, has long been central to America's food supply. Yet Gabbard described a system where farmers faced crushing water restrictions, punishing regulations, and an absence of meaningful support. She highlighted the irony of a government that celebrated its progressive values while neglecting the very people responsible for feeding the country. By doing so, she positioned Newsom not just as a failed governor, but as someone who had allowed the backbone of California's economy to weaken under neglect. Her assault on environmental management moved beyond wildfires and water into air quality and pollution. Gabbard described the disconnect between California's ambitious emissions policies and the persistent smog that still choked residents in urban areas. She criticized the reliance on punitive measures such as higher gas taxes and fees, which disproportionately harmed working families, while failing to deliver cleaner air in practice. This line of critique struck at the very heart of California's green identity, suggesting that the state's leadership had prioritized image over measurable improvements in quality of life. From environmental critiques, she pivoted into public health beyond the healthcare system itself. Gabbard highlighted the rise in drug overdoses and the proliferation of open-air drug markets in cities like San Francisco. She argued that Newsom's leadership had failed to balance compassion for addicts with responsibility to communities, resulting in unsafe streets, overwhelmed emergency services, and eroded public trust. Her focus on public health framed leadership not just as a matter of policy, but as a moral responsibility to safeguard the conditions of daily life. One of the sharpest expansions of her dismantling came when she tackled California's tax system. Gabbard painted the picture of a state where residents endured some of the highest taxes in the nation, yet received diminishing returns on their contributions. She argued that the disconnect between taxation and services represented a profound betrayal of the social contract. This was not just an economic argument, but a moral one. When citizens sacrifice through taxes, they expect their lives to improve, not decline. The failure to deliver, she suggested, was the clearest possible indicator of broken leadership. Her attention then shifted toward California's treatment of veterans, a subject close to her heart as a combat veteran herself. Gabbard described how veterans in the state often faced homelessness, inadequate health care, and bureaucratic obstacles, even as politicians like Newsom lauded their service in speeches. By invoking veterans, she struck an especially powerful chord, framing the failures of leadership not only as neglect of the general population, but as a betrayal of those who had sacrificed most for the nation. Education returned to the forefront, but this time Gabbard emphasized higher education. She argued that California's once vaunted university system had been eroded by rising tuition, administrative bloat, and political agendas that distracted from its mission of empowering students. Families who once saw a California education as a ticket to prosperity now faced crushing debt and diminished opportunities. This expansion of her critique demonstrated how leadership had failed not just in K-12 schooling, but across the educational spectrum. The cultural angle deepened further as Gabbard explored the issue of censorship and freedom of expression within the state. She described California as a place that once prided itself on free thought, but had increasingly become a hub for ideological conformity. From academia to media, she argued that dissenting voices were marginalized, creating an atmosphere where true dialogue was stifled. By tying this to Newsom's leadership, she suggested that the state's identity as a place of free expression was being eroded under his watch. Another powerful extension came in her focus on housing policy, but not in the familiar sense of cost. Gabbard zeroed in on the regulatory environment, describing how excessive zoning laws, permitting delays, and endless layers of bureaucracy had strangled the construction of new housing. She painted a vivid picture of developers bogged down in red tape, projects stalled for years, and ordinary residents priced out of the market as supply lagged behind demand. Her framing transformed housing from a matter of economics into a matter of failed governance. She also called attention to California's treatment of small-town communities, those often overshadowed by the state's glamorous coastal cities. Gabbard described how rural and small-town residents felt abandoned by leadership that seemed fixated on urban centers. From neglected infrastructure to limited healthcare access, these communities bore the brunt of leadership's neglect. By highlighting this, she expanded the scope of her dismantling to include the full geography of California, making her case that the failures of leadership reached into every corner of the state. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Tulsi exposing Newsom? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.